one of I'm sure this is such a knowledgeable group. You know, I found that most of you know more about me than I do. But did you know about the episode of me and Walt's mustache?
No.
Well, those of you who do know it, I beg you to suffer with me. It was during the war, and I had been reassigned from the Navy, which I was a Naval Reserve officer, to work at the studio on naval work for the Navy, on Navy making pictures for fighting the war in the Pacific, airplanes and weather and all those things. And my mentors were the big brass, all the scrambled eggs and Alexander de Seversky. And so I would work with these important people, and we'd have meetings with all these important Navy people. And the unit was closed off. It was part of the studio, but it was actually separate. Nobody who was still working at the studio who wasn't attached to the Navy had any access to these rooms. They were closed off with Marines and guns and all that sort of thing at the entranceway, where there once had been beautiful secretaries that brought us coffee. Now there were these Marines with guns. And I went in, I was preparing this, and I was really feeling quite expensive. At that time I was a heavy smoker. And I really didn't have any reason for quitting smoking. And it was near my birthday, and my wife had given me a new Bronson cigarette lighter. And I had unfortunately overfilled it with lighter fluid. And you can't tell that you've done that by looking at it or feeling it right away. And I put it in my pocket, and I was anxious to have this meeting be a success. So I went by the Marines and into my room, and I had all these boards arranged so that I could make a big showing and put over these points. And Mr. Alexander de Seversky was there, but sitting right next to me in the front row, and then behind us were all these other admirals and people behind. And it was Walt, and then on this side of him was Alexander de Seversky. Well, Walt didn't usually want a guy to jump right up and start telling something. He could give you a clue. Now, Ken, why don't you get up and tell us what you got here? So I sat there patiently and confidently and watched Walt with a nice mustache take a cigarette out and put it in his mouth, and it was hanging there. So I took the cigarette out and my mouth hanging there, and I got my cigarette lighter to make a big hit, and I was going to light it for him before I lit mine, being polite. But evidently Seversky had attracted his attention. So Walt turned away, the cigarette still in his mouth, turned away, he was talking to him, and he wasn't there very long. When he came back, I flashed the cigarette lighter, which happened to be, unfortunately, right under his nose. And have you ever sensed a chicken? Well, the aroma, the odor was fantastic. And he jumped out of his chair, and he faced me and said, "What the?" He's trying to burn me up, and he sailed out of the room. I haven't even explained my storyboard. Seversky and all of the other Navy people all got up dutifully and filed out too. So I was like the little skunk. And I was sure my whole career was over. But, well, I can always go back into architecture. This was an awful blow, and I wondered how I would face Polly, go home and tell her what had happened. And of course, one thing to do was to throw this wonderful cigarette lighter as far as I could, and quit smoking. All those things that I could do were too late now. But I was certain that my goose was cooked, and I was sure of it when I had nothing else to do but leave the unit. And I went out of the unit, and the word had spread. I don't know how it got out, but all my friends that were already in the service, who happened to be in the various wings to see me, done all they done. They wanted anything to do with me. And I cleared a hall, or cleared the street that fast just by appearing. Nobody wanted to be around me. My aroma was bad. So I slunk home, and terribly dejected, as you might imagine. I confessed to Polly that I was never going back there. And she said, "Oh, yes, you are." "No, can't go back, can't face that." So she go back there. So she persuaded, I don't know how, but she persuaded me, and I went back, and I did. I slunk in, and I was sitting there, again, not knowing what to do, and time passes so slowly. And then something which was so rare, almost never happened to me, and very few others, was Walt. He called on the phone about 9:30. He says, "Ken, what do you do for lunch?" Well, you know, in those days, our lunchroom we didn't have special rooms like the coral room and the gold room and all those things for important people. We had one big noisy cafeteria. But Walt loved it because there was a man in there who ran it, who always saw to it that Walt got extra good food. And Walt used to tell everybody that Victor makes the best food. In the meantime, we did lousy food. He would sit right at the table with Walt, and Walt would get a hamburger that was big and juicy with all this stuff. We'd open up our bun and look at a little right there. Walt said, "Aren't these great?" Well, anyway, he said, "What are you doing for lunch?" And I said, "Whatever." He said, "Are you free for lunch?" I said, "Yes, I am." Of course. And he said, I'll pick you up at 12:15. I'll come by your room. Well, boy, you know, Gabriel couldn't have made a happier sound on his trumpet or something. I just was well, at first I wondered if he had some trick way that he was going to torture me. What I had done. And then I thought, no, that isn't like him. He's really a nice guy, and he's forgiving me. This is the way he's going to forgive me. So sure enough, he came by, and I figured out all later. Why did he come by at 12:15? Because everybody stood in line in this cafeteria. He had set up a wonderful deal where everybody on the lot, he wanted people to have good food for very little money. And that was just like, whoa. And we did have, if we could go at a time when Victor wasn't around, we could get good food. And Walt had in mind, if he went at 12 o'clock, most of these people wouldn't see him with me. But I'm sure he must have figured out that if I take Ken over there to 12:15 and show everybody that Ken's still not in the doghouse anymore. It was his way of showing that. But I didn't dare ask him. His mustache was gone. And he had a huge, big water blister on the end of his nose. And it wasn't something you want to laugh at, not in front of him, you know, and I didn't want to even say, gee, I'm sorry, or anything like that. I just pretended that everything was all right, and he immediately started talking to me. He knew, as he always seemed to do, everything I had on this storyboard, even though I'd never seen him be in the room. He knew everything that I had thought of, everything was up there, probably, even the things that I hadn't known I was going to think of yet, he thought of. So he was busy explaining to me how he wanted me to handle this thing when we walked over to the commissary, and we walked in together, and he let it be seen by everybody in the studio, practically everybody in the studio, that he and I were together, and that ostensibly I must be forgiven. After that, people didn't disappear anymore. They accepted me back in the so that was a reason I explained that to you, or give me that incident, because I think it's very indicative of the inner gentleness and kindness of this man, who could have some employee so thoughtlessly treat his face the way I did, and still forgive him, and then go out of his way. He didn't need to do that. Go out of his way to set things up so that the studio would also feel I was okay.